said she never spoke, that behind the stone walls of the abbey, she was the quietest of them all, a shadow in white, a pair of hands folded too tightly in prayer. But silence does not mean absence, and beneath the habit, flesh still remembers. Tonight, we step into her world, a place where vows were whispered with trembling lips, where candlelight flickered across skin not yet forgotten, and where, in the stillness of night, a woman once trained to bury desire learned to let it rise. Close your eyes. Let the bells of the old abbey fade, and follow the sound of her breath.
She was known only as Sister Melisende, a name whispered in corridors and cold chapels, stitched into silence like the hem of her coarse habit. The convent she inhabited lay nestled between jagged hills and the cracked spine of a dying forest, far from the reach of towns, far from the gaze of men. It was a place of prayers, punishment, and preservation, where women vanished into obedience. But Sister Melisende's eyes told a different story. They held a glow not yet dimmed by devotion, a flicker that had outlasted the confessional. When she walked through the candle-lit halls, her movements were practiced modesty, but her shadow always lingered a moment too long on the wall, like it remembered, like it ached. Every morning the sisters gathered at the chapel, breath misting in the stone-cold air. Voices trembled in Latin hymns. But while others looked toward heaven, Melisende looked at her, Sister Thalia. Thalia's skin glowed against the pale candlelight, and when she bowed in prayer, a lock of raven hair would escape her veil, tumbling in quiet rebellion. Her lips moved without sound, but Melisende heard them, felt them, against her neck in dreams she never confessed. Sin begins in silence. Melisende scrubbed floors until her knuckles bled. She fasted until she trembled. She pressed nettles against her thighs when desire tightened like rope beneath her habit, but it only stoked the fire. One storm-heavy evening, when thunder shook loose the sky, and the sisters huddled in the dormitory for warmth, Melisende wandered, barefoot, lost between the hum of rain and her own longing. She found herself before the statue of the Virgin in the cloister's courtyard. There Sister Thalia stood, arms crossed against the chill, lips parted as though offering prayer or warning. "You shouldn't be here," Thalia said. Melisende stepped closer. "Neither should you." Neither moved away. A gust of wind carried wet leaves around them, like nature conspiring, cloaking what should not be seen. Then, trembling fingers found trembling skin. The fabric of their vows dissolved in the downpour. In that kiss was everything unsaid. The years of denial, the prayers that doubled as pleas, the quiet gazes in the garden. The touch was not carnal. It was desperate, holy, sacred in its rebellion. Their bodies met not in lust, but in aching recognition of something human, something no penance could erase. For weeks after, silence sat between them like a third sister. They said nothing in the refectory. They never brushed hands during chores, but their hearts raced in tandem during prayer, and they avoided eye contact like sinners and saints at once. One evening, Mother Abbess summoned Melisande. There were no accusations, only a question: do you love her? Melisande opened her mouth, but the truth was heavy. Mother Abbess only nodded. Then leave before love becomes confession, and you become ash. By nightfall, Melisande walked into the woods, her habit soaked in rain and defiance. In her palm, she carried not a rosary, but a strand of Thalia's hair, tied around a simple wooden ring. She vanished beyond the trees, but the statue of the Virgin still tilts ever so slightly in the courtyard, as though watching for the one who dared feel beneath the cloth. Melisande had expected the forest to swallow her, for the world to forget a fallen nun as easily as the church erased mistakes. But dawn broke gently. The rain had stopped, and birds called out as if welcoming her exile. She wandered for days, drinking from streams, sleeping under gnarled trees. Her habit grew heavy, stained with earth and sap, but her chest felt light for the first time in years. Without bells to command her steps or scripture to silence her thoughts, she remembered what it was to be a body. One evening, as mist hugged the forest floor, she came upon a stone cottage nestled near a forgotten shrine. Smoke curled from its chimney. The scent of roasted roots and something warm drifted through the air. Inside lived an herbalist named Agnes, older than Melisande, but with a vitality that startled. Her sleeves were always rolled to the elbow, hands stained with crushed petals, ash, and life. She opened her door without question, said only, "You look like someone who has tried too hard to disappear." Melisande stayed. Days became weeks. She learned the names of flowers not found in psalms. She brewed teas for fevers and salves for bruises. At night, Agnes would hum while grinding herbs, and Melisande would sit by the hearth, knees drawn up, watching the shadows dance along the walls like memories. They rarely spoke of God. One night, lightning split the sky. Agnes stood in the doorway, hair damp, a shawl barely clinging to her shoulder. "Will you lie beside me tonight?" She asked, not with lust but with the kind of loneliness that aches in the bones. Melisande did. The bed was narrow. Their knees touched, then thighs, then breathing aligned. Neither moved, but something shifted. Melisande reached up, fingertips brushing a curl of Agnes's hair from her temple. Agnes caught her wrist. "No shame here," she whispered. "Only hunger, only choice." Their lips met, tentative, reverent, not seeking conquest but permission. The kiss tasted of time and ash, of longing aged into need. Hands slid over shoulders, not to uncover but to connect. Melisande trembled, not from fear, but from finally being touched without judgment. Agnes undressed her gently, layer by layer, until the habit lay like a second skin on the floor. Beneath it, Melisende was not a nun, not a sinner, just flesh, warm, waiting, real. They made love slowly, the way one reads a prayer aloud for the first time, uncertain, sacred. Melisende wept. Agnes did not hush her. Afterward, they lay side by side, limbs tangled, the fire's glow painting golden streaks across their backs. "You carry grief like an heirloom," Agnes murmured. Melisende turned her face toward the woman who had undone her. "And you carry tenderness like a blade." They smiled. The forest did not judge them. The shrine outside remained quiet, unbothered by what took place under its roof. No thunder fell. No angels screamed. Only breath. Only skin. Only the truth of two women who had survived different forms of silence and found in each other a rhythm that sounded like prayer. It was not the first time Agnes had taken in a woman lost from the world. But with Melisende, the silence between them grew fertile, like loam that yields unexpected blossoms. In the days that followed their first night, they returned to their rhythms, tending to herbs, listening to the birds, stoking the fire. But something in Melisende had awakened, and it would not go back to sleep. She began to notice how the light played across Agnes's collarbone, or how the scent of crushed rosemary clung to her wrists. She would pause in her work, pulse quickening as Agnes laughed, throwing her head back, free in a way Melisende had never dared to be. Desire no longer arrived as punishment. It arrived as hunger, as remembrance. One afternoon, while collecting firewood, Melisende encountered a merchant's wife who had wandered into the forest to gather herbs for childbirth. The woman was heavy with child, exhausted, and her voice trembled as she spoke of loneliness. Her husband was away on a crusade. She had been left behind like many others, with land, with debt, and with silence. Melisende helped her back to the cottage. That night, as Agnes tended to the woman's swollen feet, Melisende sat watching them both. The touch between Agnes and the merchant's wife was gentle, practical, but beneath it, Melisende saw something she recognized. The need to be seen, not merely served. When the woman had fallen asleep, Melisende spoke softly. "You could love anyone, couldn't you?" Agnes didn't look up from grinding herbs. "I could, but I don't." She paused, then met Melisende's eyes. "I love you." The fire crackled. Outside, wolves howled far off but ancient and true. Later, they sat beneath the shrine, wrapped in one another's arms. Melisende leaned into Agnes's chest, fingers tracing the lines on her palm. "What did you do," she whispered, "before you lived alone in the woods?" Agnes closed her fingers. "I was married to a knight. He died. But I had already left him long before his horse did." Melisende kissed her gently, as though sealing shut a wound. "And you never looked back?" "Only once," Agnes said, to make sure I was truly alone. Melisandre's lips curved into something new, a smile not born from pleasure, but from recognition. The way fire recognizes smoke, the way water remembers the shape of the vessel that once held it. For days after, Melisandre could not pray, not even in the solitude of her thoughts, but she no longer felt lost. She felt found. Agnes began teaching her the rituals of the forest, how to call crows with the right pitch of whistle, how to make poultices from dandelion root, how to listen to a body instead of only naming its sins. One night, as Melisandre bathed in the river, bare, unafraid, under the watch of a moon that did not judge, she saw herself in the water's surface. Not as a nun, not even as a woman, but as something eternal, tender, and unfinished. Agnes joined her, slipping into the river without a word. They did not touch. They floated. Two bodies stripped of title, of story, of shame. In that moment, they were not women in hiding. They were witnesses to each other's truth. Agnes's cottage became a quiet sanctuary not just for Melisandre, but for others too, women who carried bruises from fists or words, who arrived with more silence than belongings. Agnes never turned them away. She offered salves and soup, stories and songs. And Melisandre, once cloistered in obedience, began learning a new kind of devotion, one made of touch, listening, and presence. She had never known tenderness as a daily ritual. In the convent, touch had been forbidden, closeness suspicious. But here, Melisandre would wake each morning with Agnes curled at her back, warmth steady like a vow. They would share bread, mend garments, and sit close enough that their arms brushed as they worked. There was no shame in it, only the comfort of nearness. One autumn morning, while chopping roots for tinctures, Melisandre asked softly, "Do you ever miss what came before?" Agnes didn't look up. "What came before nearly killed me." Melisandre nodded slowly. She understood. The church had not meant to kill her, but it had stripped her of her name, her laughter, her body. And now, each time Agnes touched her shoulder or kissed her fingertips, those lost pieces returned, like petals after frost. One day, a woman named Beatrix arrived. She was barely 20 and had fled a convent far to the north. Her fingers were raw from punishment. Her face bore the same frightened resilience Melisandre once carried. That night, Beatrix sobbed in Agnes's arms. Melisandre watched from the doorway, aching, not with jealousy, but with recognition. Later, as they lay together, Melisandre said, "There will always be another girl running." Agnes nodded. "So we build something for her to run to." They began storing extra food, making beds from straw, hiding blankets under floorboards. Agnes taught Melisandre how to mix moonwort and honey for healing, how to sew flesh without scarring, how to sing the old lullabies in forgotten tongues. As winter set in, snow blanketed the forest and silenced the world. Inside the cottage, life bloomed, like fire beneath ash. One night, Beatrix crept to the hearth where Melisende sat sewing. She whispered, "Is it true what they say, that if you love a woman your soul is stained?" Melisende looked up. Her voice did not tremble. "No, but the world will try to stain you for it." She took the girl's hand. "Let it try." Outside, wolves howled. Inside, 3 women sat in warmth, hands touching, hearts thawing. In that cottage, the rules of the world did not apply. Desire was not danger. Love was not a wound. Touch was not sin. Melisende began to notice the subtle changes in herself. She no longer moved like a shadow. Her steps were firm. Her hands were steady. Her gaze, once trained to avoid, now met others' eyes with quiet force. The women who came through the cottage watched her not as a former nun, but as a guide. She had not left the faith, but she had left fear. One evening, after Beatrix had fallen asleep, Agnes leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "You are becoming dangerous," she said with a smile. Melisende looked up from her stitching. "Because I believe in something else now." "Because you believe in yourself," Agnes said. "The church never taught us that." There were moments now when Melisende would wake before the others, step outside into the snow barefoot and simply breathe, as if reminding herself she was real. Not an echo, not a vessel. A woman made of blood and need, choice and heat. One such morning, a rider appeared. He wore the cross of Jerusalem on his tattered cloak and bore the stench of war. His voice was deep, cracked, and when he spoke Melisende's name, the world tilted. He was not a stranger. He had once been Brother Everard, the only monk who had ever dared smile at her in the monastery, who taught her Latin not from fear but fascination. He had gone to the Holy Land. She had gone into hiding. Now they stood before each other, unrecognizable yet tethered by a past neither had chosen. "I've been searching for you," he said. "They say you turned." "I turned toward truth," she replied, "not away from it." He said he came not to drag her back, but to understand that the war had emptied him, that in the screams of men and the silence of God he had begun to doubt everything. Melisende offered him soup, a place near the fire. She did not hide her affection for Agnes, nor did she apologize for the softness in her voice. And Everard, surprisingly, did not flinch. He stayed 3 days. He helped mend the roof, listened to Beatrix sing, told stories of the sand and the blood, of watching men kneel for forgiveness after unspeakable acts, and the way forgiveness never came. Before he left, he turned to Melisende. "You're more than you were." She answered simply, "So are you." He mounted his horse and vanished into the snow. That night, Melisende sat with Agnes and Beatrix, watching the fire. "Even the ones who return from war," she said, "are not what they were sent to be." Agnes took her hand. "None of us are. And still they love." Winter did not relent. The forest became a breathless cathedral of snow and stillness, where every step sank deep and every sound vanished in white. But within the cottage, life pulsed louder than ever. Melisande found herself listening to the creak of the wood above them, the rhythm of Agnes's breath beside her, the way Beatrix hummed lullabies while folding cloth. These were not sacred sounds taught in cloisters, but they were holy. One morning she stood before the mirror Agnes had salvaged from a ruined chapel. It was cracked, dust-fogged, but still whole enough to reflect a woman. Not a penitent, not a bride of God, a woman. Melisande reached up and touched her collarbone. She followed the line of her neck, her bare shoulder. She was still marked by the world, faint scars, a bruise from a careless knock, but none of it felt like shame. It felt like proof. Behind her, Agnes stepped in quietly, still smelling of ash and lavender. "You see yourself now," she whispered. Melisande didn't speak. She only turned and kissed her, not with hunger, with certainty. Their bodies moved with a rhythm learned not from lust, but from the ritual of tending each other daily. Melisande undressed Agnes slowly, reverently, as if peeling back memory, not cloth. They lay on the floor near the fire, the cold stone warmed by their breath, the flicker of light painting prayers on skin. Afterward, Agnes held her close. "Do you regret nothing?" "I regret the years I wasted believing I didn't deserve this." Outside, the wind shifted. Later that day, a traveler arrived, her face covered, limping from frostbite. She collapsed into Melisande's arms at the threshold. Beatrix brought cloth. Agnes fetched hot broth. The woman barely spoke, but in her eyes, Melisande saw what she had once felt. A grief so deep it made the body forget it was still alive. That night, the traveler finally murmured her name, Jean, and asked where she was. "You're in a place beyond punishment," Melisande said, "but not beyond pain." And Jean wept, not from fear, but from relief. In the following days, Melisande spent long hours with her. She washed her feet, combed the knots from her hair, listened to the gaps between her words. And in doing so, she learned something new about healing. It was not about mending what was broken, but about holding what had been denied. Agnes watched all this with pride. "You're not just a woman who left," she told her. "You're a woman who gathers." Melisande smiled softly. "I used to think I was escaping. And now, I think I was becoming." That night, 4 women lay beneath one roof. No cross, no sermons, no chains, only a quiet truth braided between them like hair, tangled, imperfect, and real. Spring crept in slowly, melting the frost from branches and loosening the grip of silence from the trees. The first crocus bloomed beneath the shrine, as if summoned by breath alone. In the cottage, it felt like time breathed too. The 4 women now moved like a chorus, each with her rhythm, each voice distinct. Beatrix had begun writing small poems on bark. Jean carved birds into scraps of wood. Melisande watched them from her place by the fire, hands buried in thread and cloth, but her thoughts drifted elsewhere. She dreamt of the old convent more often now, not with fear, but with clarity. She saw the dormitory's stone walls, the way prayers echoed off marble, the way Thalia's hair would fall just so from her veil. And with it came a question: how many others had stayed behind? Do you ever think of going back? She asked Agnes one afternoon as they gathered nettle for medicine. Agnes raised an eyebrow. Back to what? Not to submit, not to serve, but to reach. There are girls like Beatrix in every corner, waiting with blistered palms and bent knees. Agnes paused, and you'd risk that silence again. No, Melisande said, I'd break it. That night they lit a candle for every woman they had ever known but never seen again. And Melisande began to write letters, messages, small pieces of parchment wrapped in oilskin, slipped into the baskets of traveling merchants and into the saddlebags of passing riders. The words were simple. There is a place in the forest where shame does not follow, where the fire stays warm. Come if you remember yourself. And one by one they came. A woman missing 3 fingers, another who had once worn the robes of an abbess, a healer who had lost her child, a former soldier's wife whose belly bore scars from both childbirth and blade, each with a wound, each with a name. The cottage walls were expanded with wood from fallen trees, the roof rethatched, the shrine repainted with berries and ash. They called it the Haven. It was no longer Agnes's home. It was all of theirs. One morning, Melisande stood before the new threshold, barefoot, face lifted to the sun. She breathed deeply, then turned and found Agnes watching her with an expression she'd never seen before. Not lust, not even love, pride. You've made a church, Agnes said. No, Melisande smiled. We burned the old one and built a hearth instead. Inside, laughter rose like incense. And for the first time, Melisande believed in salvation, not given but made. That spring, Melisande began to write a book, not a gospel, not doctrine, but testimony. She wrote of her body, not in shame but in memory. She detailed the way her hands had once trembled with forbidden longing, and how they now steadied when tending the feet of another woman. She wrote about the scent of lavender in Agnes's hair and the way Beatrix hummed hymns that had no saints in them. She called it the flesh that remains. It won't survive, Agnes warned her gently. Paper burns. Then someone will carry the words in their blood, Melisande replied. Like I carry you. Some evenings, women would gather to listen to her read from the manuscript. They wept, not because they were sad, but because the words fit. Fit places no sermon had reached, fit aches no relic had soothed. And still they came, travelers, exiles, broken-winged women from abbeys, brothels, kitchens. The haven became a mosaic of flesh and voice. There were arguments. There was laughter. There was bleeding and birthing and mending and silence. But there was no shame. One day, a girl no older than 15 arrived. She could not speak. Her eyes were feral. Her hands were calloused as bark. But when Melisande gently touched her cheek, the girl did not pull away. They named her Lies. In the weeks that followed, Lies never spoke a word, but she followed Melisande everywhere. She watched everything. She mimicked the way Melisande crushed herbs, lit candles, offered bread. It was as though she were learning language again, not through sound, but through care. One night, after the others had gone to sleep, Lies stood beside Melisande at the hearth. She held out a small piece of wood carved into the shape of a heart. On it were not letters, but touch marks, grooves made by her fingers alone. Melisande clutched the gift and cried, not for Lies, but for herself, because once she too had been wordless. Once she too had waited for someone to name her pain without fear. In the mornings now, Melisande walked through the garden barefoot, scattering seeds like prayers. Agnes sometimes watched from the doorway, hands on her hips, smiling as if seeing a woman reborn from ash. "You lead now," Agnes said one morning. "No," Melisande replied, "I tend." But they both knew tending was a form of power the world had never taught them to name. The haven had become more than a refuge. It had become a ritual. Each morning began with the soft stirring of women waking in shared silence, the crackle of a rekindled fire, the smell of nettle tea steeping on coals. No bells rang. No voices commanded. And yet the rhythm was strong, woven from trust, not obedience. Melisande no longer marked her days in prayers but in gestures, brushing snow from a sleeping woman's shoulder, braiding the hair of someone too weak to lift her arms, sharing bread without speaking. These were liturgies of another kind, flesh as scripture, warmth as offering. One evening, as twilight pressed against the windows, Lies placed a flower behind Melisande's ear. It was crushed slightly at the edge, imperfect, but real. "Am I holy now?" the girl whispered. Melisande smiled, pulling her close. "You always were." That night, Agnes took Melisande's hand and led her outside, past the garden where lavender had begun to sprout again, down the path to the shrine. A new moon hung above them like a question. "I had a dream," Agnes said. "There was fire, smoke, a man riding, the kind who comes not to listen but to break." Melisande's jaw tightened. "A priest." "No," Agnes said, "worse. A knight who believes he speaks for God." In the days that followed, Melisande noticed changes. Fewer birds whined heavy with warning. The air no longer smelled only of soil and herbs, but of ash and iron. Then it happened. One morning, riders appeared at the edge of the forest. They did not enter, they watched, silent and still like statues carved from suspicion. Then they vanished. That night the women of the haven sat in a circle, their fire no longer just warmth, but defense. "Do we hide?" Beatrix asked. "No," Melisande said, "we remember." She stood before them all, the firelight painting gold along her cheekbones. "We are not secrets. We are not shame. If they come, they will find us unafraid." Agnes stepped beside her, and armed with more than fear. That night they sharpened old blades used for chopping roots. They filled baskets with rocks. They rehearsed silence and escape routes. But they also braided each other's hair and sang lullabies, as if to say, "We will not let fear rot what we've grown." Melisande did not sleep. She sat before the shrine and watched the moon pass through clouds like breath over a mirror. "We were never meant to live quietly," she whispered, and in the stillness she felt not dread, but readiness. The morning they came, the wind was still. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the hum of dread woven into the branches. Melisande was already awake, standing barefoot in the garden. She did not tremble. Her fingers held a sprig of rosemary, once for grief, now for memory. Behind her the haven stirred, doors opened, footsteps padded softly on the earth. "They're here," Beatrix whispered. Melisande nodded. The riders emerged from the trees like phantoms. 7 men in mail and leather, faces hidden beneath steel. One bore a tattered banner bearing the Red Cross. At their center rode a man in white surcoat, helm polished to a mirror shine. He dismounted. "I am Sir Gervais of Rents," he declared. "By the authority of His Grace the Bishop of Rouen, I've come to dismantle the heresy dwelling here." Melisande stepped forward unarmed. "There is no heresy here," she said calmly. "It's only women. Women who deny their duty to the church," he growled. "Who speak of flesh as freedom, of touch as sacrament." "We speak of truth," Melisande said, "and you fear it." The knight's hand went to his sword. But Agnes stepped beside Melisande, a blade of her own tucked beneath her cloak. Around them the other women appeared one by one, Jean with her cane, Lies with her silent fury, Beatrix with a ladle still warm from stew. They did not shout, they did not beg, they stood. Gervais hesitated. Behind him the other riders watched, young, unsure. Their armor gleamed, but their eyes faltered. There were no witches here, no demons, only firelight and bare hands. "This is not a war," Melisande said softly. "But if you start one, you will be remembered for what you burn." Something passed through Gervais's eyes, doubt perhaps, or shame. He turned. Without another word, he mounted his horse and rode into the woods. The others followed. And just like that, the storm passed. When the silence returned, it felt different. No longer tight with fear, but expansive like breath. Melisande knelt and pressed her palm to the soil. It was warm, the rosemary in her hand still fragrant. That night they gathered in song, not a hymn, not a chant, but something older, wordless, rhythmic, carried by hands clapping and feet stomping. A joy not shouted but claimed. And Melisende laughed, not because they had won, but because they had remained. After the knights left, the haven did not return to what it was. It became something new. The fear had not broken them, it had sharpened them. They worked with more urgency, laughed with fuller lungs, touched each other with deeper reverence. It was as if the threat had reminded them how fragile and sacred each moment was. Melisende moved differently now, not like a fugitive or a survivor, but like a woman anchored. She carried no weapon, but all who saw her felt the steadiness of her gaze. The girls called her the Flame Wife, not for belonging to any one person, but for being married to the fire inside them all. The book grew longer. She wrote not only her stories, but theirs. She chronicled Jean's healing, Beatrix's poems, Liza's quiet eyes that now lit with questions. She told of Agnes's hands, how they stitched not only wounds but memory. The parchment was stained with herbs, blood, tears, and ash. It was not clean. It was alive. One evening, Melisende caught Liza standing at the shrine, fingers pressed to its stones. "She never says anything," Beatrix whispered. "She doesn't need to," Melisende answered. "She listens." That night, the girl placed her palm over Melisende's heart, then rested her own head against it. No words, just rhythm. And Melisende knew. The girl was beginning to speak in a language beyond speech. 1 week later, a woman arrived barefoot, wrapped in cloth torn from her own veil. She had no name, no story she would tell. But her arms were covered in bruises and she flinched at loud sounds. They didn't question her. They welcomed her. Liza sat beside her every night, silent and still. By the new moon, the woman smiled, and Melisende wept again. Not because of pain, but because she finally understood something that had eluded her for years. Not all healing requires confession. Some only require presence. They began carving phrases from the book onto the shrine, one each week. Simple lines, short truths. You are not broken. A touch is not sin. We remain. Agnes carved the last one herself. Her hands shook not from fear, but from memory. That night, Melisende kissed every scar on her body like a vow. And Agnes, for the first time in many years, fell asleep without waking to the ghosts of old wounds. Outside, the wind carried ashwood and thyme. Inside, the women lay in warmth, not unafraid but unhidden. Summer arrived like a blessing whispered across their shoulders. The trees thickened with leaves. The herbs grew wild. Laughter echoed through the clearing as women bathed in the river, sang while grinding grain, or napped beneath linen hung to dry. There were no sermons, but there were stories, traded like gifts by the firelight, passed from mouth to mouth like incantations. Melisende no longer kept count of the days. Time was no longer something to tame, but something to taste. She woke each morning beside Agnes, tracing the lines in her lover's palms as if deciphering a sacred script. Agnes would kiss her wrist and whisper, "Your hands feel like truth." Lies had begun to draw. Her images were not of saints or martyrs, but of hands interlocked, bare feet on wet soil, open mouth singing. Melisande hung the drawings inside the shrine, and when one woman asked if it was sacrilege, Melisande simply replied, "No, it's scripture." Some nights Melisande would lie awake, listening to the sounds of the haven, the breath of women beside her, the shift of bodies in sleep, the creak of beams above. And she would wonder, if the church had ever taught this kind of peace, would it have ever needed to conquer? That thought stayed with her. One evening, a visitor arrived, alone, hooded, riding a mule. Melisande met her at the gate. "I have no name," the woman said, "only hunger." "We feed everyone," Melisande replied. She gave her broth, a blanket, silence. But over the course of a week, the woman spoke. She was once a prioress, then a prisoner, then something else, a ghost in her own story. Her voice trembled as she confessed, "They made me believe my body was a wound." Melisande took her hands. "It is." A week later, the woman shaved her head not in shame, but in release. When the others saw, they did not look away. Instead, Beatrix brought oil for her scalp. Jean brought flowers. Lies offered her a drawing, a bald woman with wings. "Is that me?" the woman asked. Lies nodded, and the woman wept. That night they celebrated not survival, but transformation. They danced without rhythm. They painted each other's backs with wild berries. They made crowns of mint and thistle and kissed like poems. Melisande stood in the middle of it all, hands stained with pigment, body warm with sweat and song. Agnes whispered to her, "You've turned our grief into ritual." "No," Melisande said, pressing their foreheads together. "We turned silence into language." And beyond the trees, the moon rose full, unashamed, unhidden, entirely whole. The last page of Melisande's book was not written in ink. It was whispered. It was lived. As autumn crept back into the forest, the women of the haven prepared not for an ending, but for harvest. They gathered fruit with bare hands stained red. They stacked herbs to dry, filled jars with honey and salt, and pressed their bodies close at night not for warmth, but for the pleasure of proximity. There was no final sermon, no procession, no cathedral walls to echo a benediction. But there was a blessing in every breath they shared. Melisande stood at the edge of the river, holding the finished manuscript. It was bound in leather stitched by Agnes, the pages thick with age and oil. Inside were hundreds of hands, voices, memories, pressed between words like flowers in the pages. She placed it inside a box carved with wild vines, not to hide, not to bury, but to preserve. "This isn't for the world to find," she told Agnes, who stood behind her. "It's for the women who already know." Agnes kissed her shoulder. Then you've written scripture. They buried the box beneath the roots of the oldest tree in the forest. And then they danced, not as resistance, not even in celebration, but because their bodies remembered what it meant to be free. That night, as the fire burned low and the air smelled of apple peel and cedar smoke, Liz climbed into Melisandre's lap and laid her head on her chest. "I want to write too," the girl said softly. Melisandre smiled. "Then write us all down." They spent the last night of summer in silence, in holding, in breath. The next morning, Melisandre awoke early, alone. She walked barefoot through the dew-kissed grass, past the garden, past the shrine. She found Agnes by the stream, her hair loose, her eyes quiet with years. "I dreamt," Agnes said, "that I was no longer needed." Melisandre took her hand. "You were never here to be needed. You were here to be loved." And in that moment the forest exhaled. It was subtle, but Melisandre heard it, felt it, as if the trees themselves had finally let go, and in their place, wind, light, space, and the memory of women who had once been erased, but had written themselves back.